Hello, everyone. Welcome to the this. Thanks for joining us today for this discussion. What does effective collaboration look like for busy engineering teams? So this is a lead dev webinar created in partnership with Apollo GraphQL. So thanks for the support there. Just as a bit of the mechanics, this webinar is going to last 45 minutes. After that, like myself and the panelists, we're going to move to the lead dev Slack and answer some of the questions in the effective teams channel. So if you have any questions that you're not able to get answered here, we can go there and keep the discussion going. We also might have time to answer a couple of questions live. So if you submit them through the QA feature in Zoom, we'll try to get them towards the end, or of course, like otherwise we can go and move to Slack. So not to waste any time, like we're going to start with some introduction. So my name is Francisco. I'm a senior director at Braze, and today I'm joined here by three great panelists. We're going to introduce themselves. So we have Allison, Dan, and Kritika. So I wanted to maybe just give you all a minute to first, thanks all for participating, but I just wanted to give you all a minute to introduce yourselves. So Allison, can you start by yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I am a fractional VP of engineering and a engineering leadership consultant. So I do fractional VP of engineering for earlier stage startups. And then as an engineering leadership consultant, I also do engineering team health checks. And I help leaders plan fun and productive offsites. I live in Washington, D.C. I have 2 kids, and I'll just plug my website. I'm AllisonMcMillan.com if you want to read sort of more blog posts and all the things about me. So that's a little bit about me.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, really interesting, like diving into your experience. But Dan, do you want to go next and tell us a bit about you?
Absolutely. I'll maybe do it in reverse order. I'm in Seattle right now, or enjoying a sunny summer. I have 3 kids, but they are the youngest just got through high school, so a little bit older. And I work at Apollo GraphQL the last couple of years, and in an evangelism sort of community building role, essentially trying to help individuals in their organizations modernize their tech or advance their tech with, in this case, GraphQL. And I came to that sort of doing that for a couple of decades almost at Expedia, just increasingly working on large initiatives to modernize. So I kind of have a unique perspective of having been at an organization watching the tech roll out and transition and all the reorgs that I think we're going to talk about today. And then started my career as a developer. So have been sort of all over the place. It's great to be here.
Thanks so much. And Kritika, can you introduce yourself to us?
Yeah, so happy to be here, and thanks everyone. I'm Kritika, and I'm a software engineer at Meta. I started when it was still Facebook about 5 years ago, and I've worked on a few different products within Meta. I've been on Facebook, I've been on Messenger, and then Marketplace. And I've mostly been on product teams, so like building stuff that all of you can use. And of course, like Meta has been in the news for having gone through a few layoffs and reorgs recently. But fun fact, prior to that, in my first ever job, I did go through a layoff, which resulted from an acquisition. So in general, I feel like I've had some experience being moved around and having to deal with the consequences of it as an IC. Happy to be here and provide my insights on the IC side of the experience.
That is great. So thanks so much. And I think I'm really excited that we have such a diverse set of perspectives. I think from the IC side, I think with some management, with Dan, who has done a long time with the same company and have seen a lot of cycles of that, but also helping companies, and Allison with both the AC, the management in leadership and consulting as well. So I think that's really a really well-rounded view to kind of talk about this topic. So starting, just giving a quick intro, I think we're talking about kind of effective collaboration for busy teams, really in this context of the current technology industry, which is like there's been a lot of restructuring and some layoffs, so like a lot of changes in companies. And I think what we want to tackle here is kind of like and talk about it is how do we deal with that in the best way. And so we're on the topic, and but of course, like I think what we're going to be talking here is about like engineering leadership in general. So I think I'm sure that like a lot of the topics that we're going to touch are going to be applied to like stable situations, but also like kind of like challenging situations. And I want to kind of take us through this conversation from like going from like a short term to like a longer term perspective. So really starting about like what happens like immediately after, like what there's a restructure, there's like a reorg, there's layoffs, like how do we deal with that? And then we're going to start talking about like, and later talk about like topics that are more kind of like in the long term. So starting, I think like in the short term, and kind of like, I want to like start with you, Allison. I think like, I'm sure like you've been consulting for smaller companies and boss to smaller companies, but also like you have this experience for like in larger companies in the past. So I'm sure you've seen this from different angles. So like, if I want to ask you like, what are the 3 areas that a leader or like manager should keep in mind after like a restructure or reorg or like an event happens to kind of keep their team going? Like what would you say there?
Yeah. So I was, I've been in a few VP of engineering at a few smaller startups, and there, right, you're nimble. In the last couple of years, there's been a lot of growth. And so organizational structure it's always changing a little bit, sort of figure out what matters and what feels right. And before that, I was a director of engineering at GitHub, where there were lots of reorgs all the time. Again, as we grew, as priorities changed, et cetera. I would say the top 3 areas, I'll go very briefly into each one, are communication, stability, and people. So first with communication, right? What is happening? What is changing? What is next? And how does this change or affect the day-to-day? For some people, it really doesn't affect the day-to-day at all. For other people, that looks different. So I think the first really important place is communication. What is going on? And second, stability, right? Getting things sort of back to normal or having them feel as least disruptive as possible. This again, like goes right along with the communication, right? What's happening, what's changing, what's next? And realistically, like, why should I care? How does it affect my day-to-day? So that will directly feed into how big or small needing to focus on stability is. And then the last one is people, right? Checking in on folks, seeing what they think, how they're doing. In my experience, some people really don't care. I mean, they're just like, cool, doesn't matter. I'm going to get back to like, I got to ship this PR. I'm going to get back to my thing. Other people, it really it impacts them greatly. And so checking in with folks, and I don't do like a one size fits all post reorg or post layoff. Like it's really about figuring out who needs what and who needs a little bit more support and who is like really fine and just wants to go along with their day. So for me, those are like the 3 areas to really focus in on after a reorg.
That's great. Thanks. Yeah, I definitely want to go back to some of those points later. But Kritika, I wanted to like see, I think you've seen that like a lot of times from like the other perspective, from like the IC perspective, like what do you think are the top 3 areas that like leaders should think about when like a situation like that happens?
Actually, as Allison was talking through her 3 points, and I was thinking about what the IC side of it was and what I was going to talk about, and it aligns so properly. Because I think when we're faced with a reorg, there's so much destabilization all around us as ICs, because everything, it's kind of like an abrupt end without any closure to the people that we were working with, the projects that we were working on, the initiatives that we were driving. And I feel like it doesn't matter if it was like a big thing or a small thing, like a big project or small project, low pri or high pri, everything kind of just falls flat on its face at that point. And I feel like there is, unfortunately, as ICs, we aren't the one with all the answers. We're the ones with the questions. And I feel like as chaotic as it might be, as ICs, I've seen myself and also my teams kind of like organize ourselves in a way that we are able to kind of maybe face the situation as a team, even if it's fragmented, like even if some of our teammates have been impacted, even if we're now split into kind of multiple subgroups, if you will. But yeah, I think that what has helped is being supportive of each other as ICs, and understanding that the people that you work with might no longer be there. Like for me, my teammate who used to sit right next to me was no longer there. But then, and that affected me. But I appreciated that people in my team understood that and they were able to check in with me. And yeah, like I said, sometimes as ICs, we're the ones with the questions and we are the ones that want to know what's going to happen next, but don't necessarily know. But being able to organize ourselves to be able to communicate that to our leadership is something that we can do instead of just going like haywire.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks so much. So like finally, like Dan, I think like you have this perspective of like you played a CTO role in a bunch of companies, so you're like ultimately like at the lead, like the ultimate leadership like position in technology. How do you see what needs to be done in that situation?
Well, first, my panelists, like, I love those answers. I just echo all of those. Maybe the underlining a couple things and then adding one. The underlines would be the communication. It's not just the, I think, what is changing that's important, but also the why and the sort of theory behind, hey, this wasn't working the way we wanted, so we're making these changes to try to achieve these goals. There's a little humility in that approach rather than acting like it's a perfect answer. It isn't a perfect answer. This is, an art, not a science. But to let people know, hey, we're trying to solve this problem, and that's why we're restructuring. That helps the individual contributors and others understand there's a reason it's not capricious. Hopefully it's not capricious. And then the other is, I was really touched by Kritika's comment about losing her colleague next to her. And my experience has been going through those changes. And this can also happen when you just have a core member of your team leave the company or something, but that there's a delayed impact sometimes for the, Allison mentioned some people just want to go back to their work. And I was one of those people. I jump on the new opportunity. Oh, there's always a flip side to this. It's positive. But then I would find 2 and 3 weeks or a month later, I was struggling for some reason that I couldn't put my finger on. And I'd say, oh, well, you had a big change. There was an emotional thing that happened and you didn't really process it. So I think as leaders, watching for that, not just in the initial week where this goes on, but in the weeks to follow, is probably something Allison does with instinctually, I'm sure. The thing I'd add is that the biggest risk, I think, is paralysis. And I think you mentioned this, that if everything changes, what does it mean for actually getting things done? And I think the delivery rhythm immediately gets thrown off. And I think this is really dangerous because, like a shark needing to swim to breathe, I think devs have to ship and deliver to feel good, right? To feel effective, to feel valuable, and also ultimately hopeful that the future will be positive. It's why they joined, right? We join these to do and to deliver, like Kritika said, solutions to customers. So I think it's crucial for leaders to find some near-term objective that they can deliver and rally around. That's not just a toy make work project, but actually something that delivers some increment of value, right? Either directly to a customer or the org. Because I think teams get reformed just like they get formed based on delivery, right, Allison? Like, you have to do. So I think that finding something to rally around to give us a new purpose is really important immediately after.
That's great, thank you. And that's a really good segue. I wanted to kind of like focus on the 2 topics that I think you all kind of like touched on. So maybe like Allison, I want to go to you and really think about like, okay, we still need to deliver projects, right? Like as Dan mentioned, like we need to like one for like the kind of like there's the morale effect of like developers and people want to kind of be useful and be productive, but also like there is a fact that there is a business outcome out there that still exists, right? So how have you seen, I think, as you advise companies and what are good examples or good practices that you think are just like how to keep the momentum going?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that there are a couple of different sides to this, right? There's the business stakeholder side, there's the people side. I agree that engineers, like they feel good when they ship. I have also seen leaders sort of like push this, like, what are you crying about? Get back to work, sort of thing as well. And so, I think that like this is a little bit counterintuitive, but I think that the first piece to keeping momentum going is to like recognize and name the change, right? Sort of like how we like recognize and name our feelings in different situations, right? Like recognize and name the change. I don't think that, I think that when folks pretend that nothing happened and pretend that it's like, oh, well, it's business as usual. Like you have 1 hour to process and then we expect X, Y, and Z. It just, I think that it erodes trust. I think that it comes back to like bite people because they might be able to shift and go heads down. But like Dan said, in 2 weeks, in 3 weeks, that's when they take the breath and they catch up and they're like, wait, like this was like a really big change. And so allowing folks to like take a pause to process, I think is super important. So that's sort of the people side. The other aspect of the people side is like encourage and support, right? So shout out wins, shout out things that are going well, make sure that folks feel valued, make sure that, like that you're just really publicly recognizing those things because it gives that extra oomph. And I feel like it helps folks not dwell in because it's like you want to give a pause to process, but you also don't want people to dwell in that for too long. So shouting out the wins, I think, can really help. On the business side, and this also builds trust with people, it's really important, I think, to make any necessary changes to timelines, to expectations, right? Because and make those visible, make them clear, and make sure that it is understood across. If you're post reorg or post layoff, you're likely dealing with at least some new set of stakeholders, new set of peers, new set of something. And so even if you've sort of like built an alignment and understanding in the past, you have to rebuild portions of that. And so, just making sure pretty quickly that any, timeline expectations, scope expectations, things that are newly at risk, like, hey, we just had a reorg, X, Y, and Z happen. I'm going to put a yellow flag on this thing because we just need to be aware and keep an eye on it for the next couple of weeks. Making sure that that's really like clear and visible. I think it's also really important for keeping momentum going because then you just recognize what's on track, what's potentially off track. And you make sure that everybody's like clear and communicated with and aligned on that fact. So yeah, I think those are like, again, the people part and the business part, sort of making sure that projects still get delivered, that momentum keeps going, and what that looks like.
That is great. Thanks so much. And I think like you mentioned also the people, again, which of course is very important. I wanted to focus on that. I think like kind of like the morale aspect of like a kind of restructuring reorg. And I think Kritika, I want to go back to you as like you kind of like mentioned how I see as the ones with the questions that like the projects and everything like falls on its face sometimes when you're like going through that. So how like in practice, like what do you think should be done, or are the best ways you've seen done, or like what shouldn't be done, I guess, that you have seen, like to kind of like that to really like keep the team supported and in like as Alison mentioned, like also help like make the team move on by like supporting them and by kind of giving them the answers that for the questions that you have.
Yeah, I think logically, I feel like I kind of view that whole post layoff, post reorg period into like 3 different themes. And I think Alison and Dan both touched upon this, and I'll tell which parts. But the first part is actually addressing what has happened, or like from the IC perspective, ICs getting that acknowledgement that something has happened and the team has been impacted. And that's the first part. And I'll dive into each one of these separately. The second part is what I mentioned about everything falling flat on its face, even if it's not supposed to be. Even, there might be projects that are in flight that have to go on. And like Dan said, developers have got to submit those diffs and land those diffs. That's the second theme. How does that, how can that go well? And then the third thing is what Allison talked about, which is now you have a new set of stakeholders, you have a new set of teams, and maybe even a new direction in which you are supposed to be focusing, and how can you execute on that. For the first one, getting that acknowledgement, I think what I've seen work well is, this is like an example that I'm taking from my personal experience, and this was something that a previous manager or mentor, they had done, and they had basically reached out to everyone on the team kind of individually, because they knew that the team was impacted and they wanted to make sure that everyone's doing fine. And I think Allison said, everyone will have a varying level of I am very deeply affected by this versus it's okay, I'm fine. Sorry, it was Dan. Yeah, but a good leader or a good manager is able to tell their team at a team level and also on a one-on-one level that they are open to talk and to answer questions if an IC has them. Okay. In my case, I wanted to talk more about my own survival guilt that I was feeling, that, that maybe someone else that was let go deserved to stay. And I know that my manager did a great job at supporting me and seeing me through those emotions, and told me some of the same things that Allison's talked about, that to not dwell on it, and do it in a way and give me some sort of an like actionable guidelines to think about how to not dwell on it. That's the first thing, getting acknowledged on the team level and on the IC level, that if this is something that you want to talk about, and if this is something that you want to process with leadership, then the doors are open. That's the first thing. About picking up pieces of what was already in flight, but then comes to a standstill. I've seen this also happen in a very beautiful and effective way. There was this big project that was in flight, and it was halted right in the middle of all of the confusion and chaos and reorgs. And I remember this one tech lead who had articulated it so well that I know the team is going through a rough time, and I know that there is changes, but this is also something that this is a project that we're excited about and we want to deliver this. So basically what this tech lead was doing was reminding us of why we took up a goal in the first place, and maybe use that to see us through this difficult time. And as in life, sometimes when we're tough, we hold on to when things are tough, we hold on to the one thing that is going to see us through and can help us look forward to something. And in this case, it was the fact that we had taken on this big project and we were very excited about the results it was going to achieve. And even though it was difficult, but things had to keep moving, even if it is at a slower pace. And I think one of our tech leads did that very well. And it spoke directly to the ICs because, it was reminding the ICs why it was so exciting to work on this project to begin with. And then this whole theme of working with a new set of people, I think it's like, it's not always easy, especially when you're mourning the impact from having lost a few folks on your team. But having given the time and space, I think if management is able to facilitate that, instead of just saying that, oh, you're now going to be working with this new set of PMs and this new set of engineers and like new data scientists, just go talk to them. If managers and if leadership is able to actually facilitate that in a way that feels friendly, in a way that it feels like a new friendship or relationship is being formed, I think that is what works very effectively. That is what has worked from my own personal experience.
That is great. Thanks so much. And thanks, Tess. I really like the way you divided it. So really appreciate that. Kind of a dive, I mean, like just like still talking about this topic, but taking a bit of a different angle to it. Is I think like, Dan, when we had our pre-chat to this conversation, you mentioned like how you like to connect, part of your role was like connecting leaders or like technical people to like the kind of like the goals of the organization, how facilitate that. And I think Critical just mentioned like there's new relationship is being formed, there's like new kind of like structures being created as reorgs and kind of like restructures happen. So do you see, I guess like this is an opportunity, is like, do you kind of, when you look at that, like as a reorg happen for like someone that's like been part of a company, of an organization, or both a manager, but like or also like individual contributor, like how to look at that as an opportunity to just like reframe problems and kind of like connect people to like kind of like the goals, to the new goals that now exist?
I think I do. Yeah. And I want to bring us as developers back a little bit to the other kind of architecture, from organization architecture, for a moment, because first of all, I'm a huge believer in all the human factor stuff we've been talking about is so crucial. One of the things, though, that all this gray hair gives you is, having seen this play out time and time again, is that actually the technical architectures, the platform architectures play a role here, right? Because they tend to, as Conway's law says, right, we typically conform those platforms around our org or communication structure. So if we model our apps and our APIs and cloud tech around an org model, and then we change the org model, right, we get a real shear force, right? People don't own the same stuff, and good work and good ideas can get left behind, to your point. So then you feel disconnected from those objectives. So what are leaders supposed to do in that, right? And I think the good news is there actually is an approach that the industry has found in a couple different areas of the stack, and I think in all areas of the stack, that works better and can work through reorgs. And so I'm going to give you some examples here. So in the front ends, right, replacing our sort of hand-built front end apps monoliths with declarative, reactive, modular components architectures like React and SwiftUI that came out of Facebook. Why did we adopt those? Because how do we figure out how to get 100 or 1,000 front end devs to work together, right? We said, well, what are the modules that exist in the product, the feed in the Facebook app? There has to be a feed. It's just true, right? It doesn't matter how you org. And I think that that's a clue that if we can model around some of those maybe jobs to be done, not just around the org that owns the feed, but like let's organize around the actual customer job to be done, or the organizational job to be done, it's more effective. And if we look at the cloud native side of things, what's going on with Kubernetes, right? We used to have custom build pipelines and deployment stuff, and now we have this declarative approach. Same deal. I think those technologies are more resilient, and when you change, it's easier for those to be transition between teams because you've described sort of more what you want to do, not the hand-built logic code that implements it. And obviously, I work at an API company, and I think that the middle of that stack, the thing that connects that backend cloud stuff and the front ends, is our API layer. And I think Facebook also recognized that to power and feed and maybe hydrate those modular components, we need an API strategy or approach that is more self-service and more modular. And I think that's what GraphQL is. So in each of these layers, here's my point, here's my thesis. In each of these layers of the stack, I think we model the jobs to be done, whether it's a UX component or a deployment artifact or a graph of the different things in your API, connecting your APIs so that you can get all the data. Regardless of what team restructures, you can go to a common place, right? And you can figure out deployment, you can figure out where the component is, and you can figure out the APIs. That way, rather than modeling around our org, which is going to change, every few years, it's always going to change, then it's less likely than that model that good ideas at work get left behind because it's inevitable. I mean, these things, they work on a pendulum. We'll probably talk about this later, Francisco, but like there's the cycle and we org, and then, we get, Allison's seen it, I'm sure, in your career too. And you will in yours, Kritika, is like this, the pendulum will swing and then we'll reorg the other way and then and it's just part of the process. So I think the choices we make in our platform architectures can help us set up better for that inevitable change.
Nice. That's interesting. Yeah, the connection between tech and people, I think, like in the organization, really like is something that always kind of interested me as well. Maybe like one point, I think, just like playing a bit of the like the other side on that is, and I want to ask like Alice on that. Like I think like there is a fact that like when you change the org structure, you kind of like change the technical, you might have to change the technical structure, so the ownership of like code and kind of like all of that. And like, is that part of the conversation, I think, from your perspective, or have you seen Allison, like, do you recommend that to be part of the conversation, the reorg that happens kind of like as part of this discussion? Is that something that teams do later? Like, how do you think about like the whole technical ownership and just like structure that is impacted by kind of like the reorganization?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that that there are definitely conversations that have to happen about technical architecture, handoffs, if boundaries are changing, or if ownership is changing. Those can also be really great opportunities to recognize when maybe your team or org or whatnot is too dependent on one individual or on too much knowledge in a few individuals' brains, right? So yes, there is sort of, picking a front-end approach or picking a modular approach that is likely something that more engineers have been exposed to, as opposed to having a hand-rolled, approach. There's also, thinking about documentation, and I've done sort of ADRs. I love, decision records. Those are great places to, see, even for an individual I see, it's like, what was past me thinking when I put in this? Like, I'm angry at past me right now. I want to be less angry at past me. What was past me thinking for current me, right? And so, I think that it's also really good places to figure out documentation. And sometimes if there's a handoff conversation or a handoff document that's happening, it's really good to think about that, not as a point in time, like, oh, I have to transfer this knowledge to this other individual or to this other team, but what's the structure? What's the way that can be baked into the organizational culture? You have to have this conversation anyway. How can you do it in a way that is actually really effective and helpful for everyone, as opposed to just the two people that happen to match time zones and can meet and chat about that technical piece that's being, handed off or onboarded into a different team.
That's right. That makes sense. Thanks so much. I have a question I want to follow up, but before, just a reminder for everyone that's listening, you can post questions in the chat if you are live, and we'll try to answer them and ask as we go in the last 10 minutes. So I want to dive into a specific topic that I think like everyone kind of has been mentioning, like in the kind of like the answers, like the past few answers, which is about like there's new kind of knowledge and relationships and team connections that are happening. And I think Kritika, you kind of made that point. You kind of really honed in on that point. The fact that there's like new stakeholders is not easy, and I think like in your role, like I think like you as an IC, you also have this responsibility of leading projects and kind of organizing engineers and organizing projects to kind of be delivered. So Kritika, what do you think what is kind of like how should someone think about like these new relationships, and like who should one like think about how to establish them well, and how to kind of make sure that these connections are created as soon as possible so that teams and projects can move forward?
Yeah, firstly, I want to plus one on Allison's point of like what was past me thinking when she said that. I could think of all the times when I was like, what was I thinking when I built this, or what was I thinking when we architected this? But anyway, I think from the technical perspective, I just want to, like tie that point kind of into this and say that not that we build all of our products with this kind of mindset that eventually it's going to be handed off to someone else, or like it's going to get scrapped, or we are going to have to rebuild it. But I almost feel like those having kind of that parallel thought process when we're building things can really help us understand as we're building, if we are building the most resilient product, or like building it in the most robust way possible. Yeah, I think when it comes down to building new relationships, especially with stakeholders, or especially with people who are going to eventually take over all the stuff that you've built, or when it comes to handing off, I would treat it just like any other project. So it needs planning, it needs some sort of a timeline, a schedule, and it also needs some sort of milestones. First of all, I feel like when you're going through a big transition, and the context of all of my views is that you're handing off your team, or like some of the stuff that you've architected, to another team, and it comes with a lot of like past decisions that have been made, and a lot of like historical context that may be involved, and it's not always easy to keep a paper trail of everything. But that's when the importance of having some sort of a wiki or documentation really kind of makes itself known. And I think that just like having some sort of documentation is a great way to make the whole process easy, for when you're interacting with new stakeholders, when you're interacting with people and engineers who are going to pick up where you left off. And this, it also like is a great kind of junction where you can really audit and question all of your I don't know, design decisions, and question all of the things that you've built. I know that we've done that. I've done that in my team, and really thought about, at this point, if we are no longer going to maintain this, does it really make sense to even keep this running? Does it make sense to hand this over to the new team? And that's one thing that is a benefit of going through this whole process of transitioning from one kind of like team to another.
That makes sense. Sorry. Oh,
Yeah,
didn't want to
no,
interrupt you.
no, you
Awesome.
didn't.
Perfect. Thanks so much. I would actually bring that we have some questions in the Q&A, so I'm gonna bring one. I think there's a good point to bring one here because we've talked a lot about engineering. I think like in terms of like the engineering centric view, and I think Renan has this question about and I'll ask you, Allison, because I think you've been consulting, like I think in different companies. Like, how do you see other stakeholders, designer, PMs, customer success playing a role in how effective engineering teams can be, and how can the engineers take advantage of their knowledge? And I think, like, of course, like let's talk about like this transition period, like how these other disciplines like can help.
Yeah, and we talked a lot about communication. We talked about cross collaboration and creating relationships with stakeholders and new stakeholders. I think that all of these other stakeholders are, it's always really critical to create relationships with them as well. The way that I see it is sort of don't wait for a reorg to happen before building those relationships. Figure out what department, what area, what piece you have never had a conversation with anyone in that segment, and pick someone who seems nice and say like, hey, I don't know anything about your area. I'd love to learn more, right? Create those inroads, create those connections and those relationships, because when who's in what seat changes, either you'll be collaborating with that person even more, or maybe you're collaborating with somebody that they know and then they can vouch for you, and your relationship starts off sort of one step above where it could. I think in terms of other stakeholders, it's important that they understand the why as well about a reorg, about why the structure of engineering is changing and what that looks like. And it's important. I've seen reorgs that make it much more difficult for some of these other stakeholders to do their jobs effectively and to know who to go to for what. And I've seen others that really take them into account, where before you're talking to these stakeholders and saying like, what about our structure is working for you? What about our structure isn't working for you? And so they're really, they're a part of the process, and they are a consideration factor when thinking about organizational structure.
That's awesome. Thanks so much. That's really exactly. So like we have 2 minutes, and I want to ask one last question, which and then I'll pick you for the final question, which is it's kind of related to something I was asking QA, but I really like, I think talking about like how final, like we talk about reorg, we went through the cycle, and I think like we got to this new structure. So how final that should be? Should teams like after they have been like reorg, restructured, reevaluate, like if that's making sense? And how can, I think one question that was asked here was like, how can ICs be part of that conversation? Like, how should they think about as well as being part of that? So yeah, what are your thoughts on the topic?
First of all, absolutely. Yeah. I think there's a crucial role for ICs. If you think about it, and we talked about it being an art, not a science, the leaders are looking at the big picture things, and they have come up with the best compromise. It's always messy about how to structure that reorg, but that's the big thematic goals. They don't know, because they don't live the experience that you have as individual contributors. They don't know the details, right? And they rely, I think, and often maybe don't say it enough, but they rely on the subject matter experts to interpret the goals and make them real. And that means that, in a sense, our leaders need to help empower us, and we need to empower ourselves to interpret the objective into a practical, like, okay, here's what we're going to do. My biggest advice, don't do stupid things because you think your leader told you to do a stupid thing. I guarantee you they don't want it to be stupid. And if everyone in your team knows it doesn't make sense, don't do it. Do the best version of what you can do to align with them. And I've talked to, senior leaders in my company about this, and they're like, yeah, we assume we know it's broad strokes. We hope you interpret it. So don't assume that because a word was said, you have to do exactly a thing. I think ICs are absolutely crucial to interpreting and making it make sense. So don't unempower yourself, even though that's, stay involved and guide the organization toward where it's better.
That's great. And that's right on time. Thanks so much. This is a great answer to close our webinar. So thanks so much, Allison, Kritika, and Dan for like all your insights on that. I love like all the different perspectives. So we'll close this webinar, and thanks everyone for like attended. And we'll be like for the next 15 minutes in the Slack, and we can move the questions there and the conversation there. So thanks everyone. I'll see you in Slack.